Sign right here. After tonight, you are going to be his wife." Those were the exact words my mother, Patricia Whitmore, shoved into my face along with a thick, 10-page marriage contract. I stood absolutely frozen in the middle of my parents' living room in Blackridge, Montana. It was February 2024, the absolute coldest time of the year, but the freezing chill I felt inside that house had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. Let me back up a little bit to give you some context. I'm Clara Whitmore, and I'm 30 years old. To understand how I ended up staring at a forced marriage contract in the 21st century, you need to understand where I come from. Blackridge is a tiny mountain town where practically all the land is owned by just a few old, wealthy families. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your business, and family reputation is treated like a religion. Earlier that Saturday evening, I had received a text message from my mom. It read, "Come home for dinner. The whole family is waiting for you." It sounded normal enough, maybe a little demanding, but that was typical for her. So I made the drive. When I stepped through the front door, though, there was no dinner cooking. Instead, I walked into the living room and found two men waiting. One was a notary public, holding his official gear. The other was a strange man who looked to be around 45 years old. Before I could even ask what was going on, my dad walked over to the front door and locked it. Then, my mom pushed that 10-page contract across the table toward me and dropped her shocking bombshell about me becoming this stranger's wife. But here's the thing they didn't know. I had been preparing for this exact kind of moment for 2 whole years. I wasn't the helpless, obedient little girl they thought they had trapped. To make sense of their insane ambush, you have to look at how I had been living my life before that night. I didn't live in Blackridge anymore. I had my own place in Helena, which was about an hour's drive away from my parents' house. I worked as a records manager at an insurance company. My day-to-day life was very simple, extremely quiet, and fully independent. I paid my own rent, made my own schedule, and enjoyed my peace. But to my mother, Patricia, my life was a complete and utter failure. She operated on a deeply ingrained, old-school belief system. In her mind, a woman absolutely must get married. Furthermore, she believed a daughter must live close to her family. Above all else, she believed that my sole purpose in life was to serve and uphold our family's reputation in the town. Being a single, independent, 30-year-old woman making an honest living in another city just didn't fit her script. Because I didn't fit their perfect image, my parents spent years trapping me in a twisted cycle of control. It wasn't just typical parental nagging. It was a daily, systematic effort to break me down and force me into submission. They would call me every single day just to check up on me and dictate what I was doing. If I didn't answer or try to set boundaries, they would escalate. They started making up completely fake stories about me and spreading them to our relatives. The whole point of this manipulation was to constantly pressure me to pack up my life and move back to our small town where they could watch my every move. Some of the things they did were completely unhinged. For example, my mom started telling people that I had been fired from my job, which was a total lie. I was still happily employed. My dad would tell family members that I owed the family a bunch of money, which was another complete fabrication. It got so bad that they even went around telling my neighbors that I had severe psychological problems and mental issues. When the people who are supposed to love and protect you spend years spreading vicious rumors and micromanaging your reality, it messes with your head. After a while, their constant manipulation actually started working. I began to doubt myself. I wondered if maybe I was the crazy one. I wondered if I was a bad daughter for simply wanting my own life. It was a suffocating, terrifying feeling to slowly lose grip on your own reality because your parents are constantly gaslighting you. Let me tell you more about the drive from Helena to Blackridge that night. It takes an hour on a good day, but in the dead of February, the icy roads and blinding snow make it feel much longer. I remember gripping the steering wheel, my heater blasting, feeling a familiar knot of deep anxiety in my stomach. Every time I went back to Blackridge, I felt like I was shrinking back into the scared, controlled version of myself. The town itself is completely dominated by its old money. A few families essentially run everything: the businesses, the local politics, the social scene. If you aren't part of their elite circle, you are basically a pawn. My parents were obsessed with how they appeared to these wealthy families, and I was their biggest disappointment. Working as a records manager taught me to be meticulous and highly organized. At the insurance company, I dealt with facts, dates, hard evidence, and paper trails. My job required me to look at data objectively. I loved the quiet hum of the office and the absolute predictability of my independent life in Helena. There was no drama, no screaming matches, no one telling me I was crazy. It was my sanctuary, but that sanctuary was constantly under attack. The daily phone calls from my parents weren't just simple check-ins. They were interrogations. Where are you? Who are you with? Why didn't you pick up on the first ring? If I tried to pull away, the retaliation was swift and cruel. The rumors they spread weren't just harmless gossip. They were calculated strikes meant to isolate me so I would have no one else to turn to. When my mom told people I was fired, I had relatives calling me offering unwanted pity and unsolicited advice. When my dad lied and said I owed them money, it painted me as an irresponsible, ungrateful child in the eyes of my extended family. And when they whispered to neighbors about my supposed mental health issues, it was the ultimate betrayal. It meant that if I ever tried to speak out about their abuse, no one would believe me. They would just think, oh, that's just Clara. She's mentally unwell, exactly like her parents said. That's exactly why I started doubting my own sanity. When you hear the same lies repeated enough times by the people closest to you, a part of your brain starts to believe them. I would sit in my quiet apartment in Helena, replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I had remembered them wrong. Did I actually say that? Am I being unreasonable? Am I really a failure because I'm 30, unmarried, and working a normal corporate job? But I wasn't crazy. I was just suffocating under their extreme need for control. And as I stood in that living room on that freezing Saturday night, looking at the 45-year-old stranger in the notary, listening to the deadbolt click on the front door, all the puzzle pieces of their abusive behavior finally snapped into place. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as an asset, a tool to be used. Sign right here. After tonight, you are going to be his wife, my mom had said, sliding the 10 pages toward me. I looked down at the paper, then at the stranger, then at my parents. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg. They expected me to eventually break down and do exactly what I was told, just like I had done when I was a kid. But like I said, they had no idea what I had been doing for the last 2 years. They had no idea that I had finally woken up from their gaslighting. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore, and I certainly wasn't going to be sold off in this stupid, frozen mountain town. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold draft seeping in through the old living room windows. The notary shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clutching his official stamp, while the man they wanted me to marry simply stared at me with an entitled, impatient look. My dad stood blocking the locked door, his arms crossed, his face set in stone. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock. They thought they held all the cards. They thought my isolation in Helena and the years of psychological manipulation had worn me down completely. They believed that locking the door and ambushing me with a legal document would force my hand and make me surrender. What they failed to realize was that my job as a records manager hadn't just given me a paycheck. It had trained my brain. It taught me the absolute power of documentation. While they were busy spinning lies, calling me crazy, and setting up this insane trap, I had been quietly, methodically building my own defense. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't scream. I just stared back at them, knowing exactly what I had already set in motion before I ever drove into Blackridge today. To fully grasp how I ended up in that living room standoff with a 45-year-old stranger in a marriage contract, you have to understand what my life actually looked like. I lived completely alone in a quiet apartment in Helena, which was exactly a 1-hour drive away from the suffocating, drama-filled bubble of Blackridge. My days were wonderfully predictable and calm. I worked as a records manager at a local insurance company. My life was incredibly simple, peacefully quiet, and entirely independent. I loved waking up, making my own coffee, going to a job where people respected my intelligence, and coming home to a space that belonged only to me. But to my mother, Patricia Whitmore, my independent life in the city was nothing short of a massive failure. She operated on a deeply ingrained, old-fashioned mindset that dictated exactly how a woman was supposed to live. According to her strict beliefs, a woman absolutely had to get married. Not only that, but she also believed a daughter must live close to her family, and that her ultimate purpose in life was to serve and uphold the family's reputation in the community. Being a single, self-sufficient woman with a corporate job did not fit her narrative at all. Because I chose a different path, my parents launched a relentless, years-long campaign of control against me. They treated my independence as a personal insult. 4 years, they called me every single day just to check up on me, track my movements, and try to dictate my life. When I didn't comply or try to set healthy boundaries, they escalated their tactics. They started making up horrible stories about me and deliberately spreading them to our relatives. They constantly applied intense, suffocating pressure to force me to pack up my life and move back to our small town where they could watch me. The lies they told were incredibly damaging and calculated to destroy my credibility. My mother went around telling people I had been fired from my job, even though I was perfectly employed and doing great at the insurance company. My father told our relatives that I owed the family a bunch of money, which was a complete fabrication. It got so bad that they even went as far as telling my neighbors in Helena that I had severe psychological problems. The constant barrage of gaslighting took a huge emotional toll on me. After a while of hearing these vicious lies repeated back to me by confused relatives and friends, I actually started to doubt myself. I wondered if my memory was failing, or if I really was the unstable, ungrateful daughter they constantly painted me to be. That was when I decided I needed a permanent anchor to reality. 2 years ago, I started doing something that would eventually save my life. I began keeping a secret notebook. It started out as a simple diary, but because of my professional background as a records manager, it quickly evolved into a highly organized chronological archive. I started saving every single text message they sent me. I took screenshots of their demanding messages and began secretly recording our phone calls. Over those 2 years, that secret notebook grew to be over 300 pages thick. Initially, I didn't do this to build a legal case against my own parents. I started the notebook simply to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. Whenever my mom would flat out deny saying something cruel, or my dad would try to gaslight me about a previous conversation, I would flip open the notebook or listen to a recording and validate my own reality. But as the pages filled up with undeniable, stamped proof of their emotional abuse and manipulation, I realized that this notebook was no longer just a personal comfort. It had become a massive pile of hard evidence. With my sanity intact and my boundaries slowly building, I thought I could just keep them at arm's length. I ignored the daily calls when I could and focused on my career. But then, exactly 3 weeks before that fateful dinner in Blackridge, everything blew up. It was a Tuesday night, and my phone started buzzing aggressively on my nightstand at exactly 12:47 a.m. I woke up groggy, expecting a family emergency. I looked at the glowing screen and saw it was my Aunt Marina cold calling. Aunt Marina was my dad's sister, and unlike my parents, she actually had a conscience and a good heart. I answered the phone, and immediately, I could hear her trembling voice on the other end. She sounded terrified, whispering frantically into the receiver, so no one in her house would hear. "Clara, you need to know what they are planning," she said. "Your father owes the Keller family $175,000. My blood ran completely cold. The Kellers were the richest family in our entire town. They were massive, wealthy ranch owners who essentially owned half of the land in Blackridge. Their wealth gave them untouchable status, and everyone in town bowed down to them. The heir to their ranching empire was a man named Thomas Keller, who was 47 years old. I knew exactly who he was, an arrogant, entitled man who walked around town like he owned the people in it. Aunt Marina then dropped the bombshell that made me physically sick to my stomach. She told me that my parents and the Kellers had reached a secret, twisted agreement behind closed doors. I was going to marry Thomas Keller. "Marina, what are you talking about?" I asked, sitting up in bed, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. "They can't just force me to marry someone. This isn't the 1800s. But Marina had the terrifying details. She explained exactly what she had overheard them planning. The marriage contract was already drafted by a lawyer and ready to go. They were going to trap me by hosting the wedding ceremony right inside my parents' house. There would be a notary public present to make the documents legally binding on the spot. There would be absolutely no guests, no friends to intervene, no celebration. I was just supposed to show up for a family dinner, sign the papers, and say I do. In exchange for handing me over to this 47-year-old man, my father's massive $175,000 debt to the Keller family would completely disappear. I sat in the dark of my Helena apartment, holding the phone to my ear, completely paralyzed by what I was hearing. My own parents had put a price tag on my life, and that price was exactly $175,000. They had literally sold me to cover up my father's massive financial failure. Suddenly, all the puzzle pieces from the last 2 years fit together perfectly. All the intense pressure to move back to Blackridge, all the attempts to isolate me from my friends, the vicious rumors about my mental instability, it was all meticulously designed to make me so vulnerable, so broke, and so alone that I would have no choice but to surrender to this arrangement. If the entire town thought I was a mentally unstable, unemployed woman who owed money, who would believe me if I cried for help? Who would intervene if Thomas Keller suddenly took me in as his wife? They were setting the stage to make my forced marriage look like a wealthy, generous man taking pity on a crazy, ruined woman. I thanked Aunt Marina, promised I wouldn't expose her, hung up the phone, and turned on the bright lights in my apartment. I didn't go back to sleep that night. Instead, I walked over to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out my secret notebook. The 300 pages of evidence sat heavily in my hands. My parents thought I was a naive, broken girl living in isolation. They thought their ambush would work seamlessly, but they had made a fatal mistake. They forgot that I managed records for a living. They forgot that my entire career was based on tracking details, building timelines, and securing documentation. They were planning to spring a trap on me, but thanks to Aunt Marina's midnight call, I now had 3 full weeks to prepare a massive, undeniable trap of my own. I wasn't just going to avoid signing that contract. I was going to blow their entire scheme wide open. Sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m, staring at the 300 pages of evidence I had collected, I realized something very important. I could not fight this battle alone. My parents were crazy, but the Keller family was incredibly wealthy and powerful. If I just showed up to that dinner and refused to sign, my dad would probably physically block the door, and Thomas Keller would use his money and influence to make my life a living hell. I needed real, heavy-duty legal backup. I needed a lawyer who wouldn't be intimidated by the Blackridge old money. So, the very next morning, I picked up my phone and called an old friend of mine named Ethan Brooks, who was working as a lawyer over in Missoula. Ethan and I went to college together, and he had always been sharp, aggressive, and fiercely protective of his friends. More importantly, his law firm was in a completely different city, meaning the Kellers had absolutely no influence over him or his career. I asked Ethan if I could drive over to Missoula to see him. When I walked into his office, I didn't waste any time with small talk. I dropped my massive, 300-page notebook right onto his desk. I explained the midnight phone call from my Aunt Marina, the $175,000 debt my dad owed the Kellers, and the secret marriage contract they had drawn up to sell me to a 47-year-old man. Ethan sat there in silence and started flipping through my notebook. He read the insane text messages from my mother. He listened to a few of the audio recordings where my dad threatened me. He looked at the meticulous dates and times I had recorded every single instance of their harassment. I watched his face shift from professional curiosity to absolute disgust. When he finally looked up at me, he didn't sugarcoat the situation. After reading my diary, Ethan looked me dead in the eye and said, "This isn't a family matter. This is coercion and marriage trafficking." Hearing a licensed attorney say those exact words out loud felt like a massive weight being lifted off my chest. For years, my parents had convinced me that their behavior was just tough love and that I was the crazy one for not appreciating my family. But Ethan completely validated my reality. My parents weren't just being strict, they were actively breaking the law and trying to trade a human being to settle a financial debt. "We are going to crush them," Ethan told me, "but we have to do it by the book. If we just warn them, they will hide the contract and pretend you are making it all up. We need to catch them red-handed." Right then, and there in his Missoula office, Ethan and I formulated a bulletproof plan. We mapped out exactly how we were going to turn their trap into a federal nightmare for them. The strategy had 4 very specific steps. First, we decided that I needed to apply for an emergency protection order against my parents and Thomas Keller. Second, we were going to officially file a coercive control report. Third, Ethan insisted that we had to notify the police in advance so they would be ready to step in the second things went sideways. And finally, We agreed that I had to record the entire evening to capture the moment they tried to force me to sign the contract. Ethan spent the next few weeks drafting all the necessary legal paperwork. We kept everything completely quiet. I still answered my mom's annoying phone calls, playing the part of the tired, oblivious daughter. I let her remind me about the important family dinner coming up on Saturday. I didn't give her a single clue that I knew about her twisted plan. Then came the day of the dinner. The trap was finally set. On the morning of the dinner, I officially put our plan into motion. I called my boss at the insurance company and took the day off work. I told him I had a severe family emergency to handle, which was technically the absolute truth. I drank a strong cup of coffee, grabbed my thick folder of legal documents that Ethan had prepared, and drove straight to the district courthouse. The courthouse was cold, quiet, and intimidating, but I didn't feel scared at all. I felt focused. I walked up to the clerk's window and submitted all the paperwork. Because of the severity of the allegations and the massive pile of evidence I brought with me in my notebook, they fast-tracked my case to a judge for an immediate review. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the hallway waiting. I thought about Thomas Keller, sitting in his massive ranch, thinking he had just bought a 300-year-old piece of property. I thought about my dad, relieved that his $175,000 debt was magically going away. I thought about my mom, thrilled that she finally had me under her absolute control again. They were all probably getting ready for the dinner, ironing their clothes, completely unaware that I was sitting outside a courtroom about to drop a nuclear bomb on their lives. Finally, the bailiff called me into the courtroom. The judge was a stern-looking woman who had clearly read through Ethan's brief and my notebook. She asked me a few direct questions to confirm the details of the $175,000 debt and the forced marriage arrangement. I answered clearly and confidently. She didn't need to hear anything else. She picked up her pen. A judge officially signed the emergency protection order at exactly 10:12 a.m. I watched the ink dry on the paper. That single signature completely changed the power dynamic of my entire life. The judge handed the document to the clerk to be stamped and finalized. The order clearly mandated a strict restraining distance of 150 meters. This meant that if my parents or Thomas Keller came within 150 meters of me, they would be immediately arrested. And the most beautiful, critical detail of the entire document, the order was effective immediately. I walked out of the courthouse, holding the certified copies of the protection order in my hand. The cold February air hit my face, but I felt incredibly warm. I had the Adult Protective Services Coercive Control Report filed. I had the emergency protection order signed and active. I had a small, high-quality digital audio recorder sitting in my purse, fully charged and ready to go. Ethan had also done his part. He had preemptively contacted the local law enforcement in Blackridge, giving a specific officer a heads-up about a potential hostage and unlawful detention situation happening at my parents' address that evening. He gave the police my license plate number, a description of my car, and a clear instruction to wait for my signal. Everything was perfectly lined up. I got back into my car, turned on the heater, and looked at the clock on my dashboard. It was time to drive to Blackridge. It was time to go to dinner. They thought they were setting a trap for a naive, broken girl. They were about to find out that they had just invited a fully armed records manager to the table. It was exactly 7:05 p.m. when I finally pulled my car into my parents' snowy driveway in Blackridge. The winter air was biting cold, but inside my coat, my heart was beating with a steady, calculated rhythm. I sat in the driver's seat for a few seconds, staring at the front door of the house I grew up in. Inside my purse, resting right next to my wallet, were the certified copies of the emergency protection order and the Adult Protective Services report. I reached into my coat pocket, felt the cold metal of my digital audio recorder, and clicked the record button. A tiny red light blinked to life. I took one last deep breath, got out of the car, and walked up the front steps. When I opened the front door and stepped inside, the bizarre reality of their sick plan hit me instantly. My mother had texted me saying the whole family was waiting for me to have dinner, but there was absolutely no smell of food in the air. The kitchen was completely dark and empty. Instead, I walked into the living room and found a scene that looked like a cheap, twisted, nightmare version of a wedding chapel. My mother had actually taken the time to decorate the room. There were lit candles placed strategically around the living room, casting a flickering, dramatic light over everything. Several large, expensive-looking floral arrangements were set up in the corners. In the center of the room, they had cleared out the coffee table and replaced it with a small, rigid table draped in a perfectly pressed white tablecloth. But there were no dinner plates, no silverware, and no glasses. Sitting right in the middle of that stark white tablecloth was the thick, 10-page marriage contract and a single, heavy metal pen. Pulled up right to the edge of the table was one single chair, positioned explicitly for me to sit in. Standing around this ridiculous setup were 4 people. My mother, Patricia, wore a forced, frantic smile that didn't reach her eyes. My father stood near the entryway, looking incredibly tense. Then there was the notary public, a man clutching a leather briefcase to his chest, who looked entirely out of place and slightly confused. And finally, standing near the fireplace with his hands in his pockets, was Thomas Keller. He looked exactly like the arrogant, entitled 47-year-old ranch heir I remembered. He didn't even bother to greet me. He just stared at me like I was a new car he was about to test drive. "Clara, darling, come in," my mother said, rushing forward to grab my arm. She tried to guide me toward the single chair waiting at the white table. "We have a very special evening planned. A surprise." I pulled my arm out of her grip and stepped back. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked over to the table and looked down at the contract. My parents expected me to act like a submissive, confused daughter. They expected me to be intimidated by Thomas Keller's wealth and my father's stern presence. But they completely forgot who they were dealing with. I was a records manager. I spent 40 hours a week reading fine print, identifying legal liabilities, and finding loopholes. I wasn't intimidated by a stack of paper. I was in my element. I didn't sit in the chair. Instead, I picked up the contract and started flipping through the pages. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room burning into my back. "Sign right here," my mom urged, stepping closer and tapping her manicured finger on the final page. "After tonight, you are going to be his wife." I completely ignored her and kept reading. What I saw on those pages made my stomach turn. This document was entirely unhinged. It wasn't just a standard prenuptial agreement designed to protect Thomas Keller's massive family wealth. It was a literal cage mapped out in legal jargon. I read Clause 4, which explicitly stated that immediately following the signing of the document, I would be required to terminate my lease in Helena and move my permanent residence to the Keller family ranch. Then I got to Clause 7, which was even more insane. It legally required me to submit my formal resignation to my employer and quit my job within 60 days of the marriage. I kept reading. Another section demanded that all of my personal finances, including the savings I had built up over a decade of working, be immediately transferred into a joint bank account that would be controlled solely by Thomas. But the absolute worst part was a travel restriction clause buried near the back. The contract literally stated that I was not allowed to leave the county limits without obtaining explicit, written permission from my husband. I stood there, holding the thick stack of paper, and a cold realization washed over me. I looked at the words, "Quit my job," "joint bank account," and "cannot leave the county." This was not a marriage proposal. This wasn't even an old-fashioned arranged marriage. This was absolute, total control. They were trying to strip away my income, my home, my independence, and my basic freedom of movement. It was human trafficking disguised as a civil contract, orchestrated by my own parents to pay off a $175,000 debt. I carefully placed the 10-page contract back onto the white tablecloth. I aligned it perfectly with the edge of the table, just the way I like my files at work. I looked up, made direct eye contact with my mother, and said in a totally flat, calm voice, "I am not signing this." The fake smile instantly dropped off my mother's face. Thomas Keller, who had been leaning casually against the fireplace, suddenly stood up straight, a dark scowl forming on his face. Before anyone else could speak, my father moved. He marched directly over to the heavy wooden front door, slammed the deadbolt shut with a loud click, and physically planted his body right in front of the exit. He crossed his large arms over his chest, blocking the only way out of the living room. He glared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. "You are not leaving this house until this is done," my father barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "You are going to sit in that chair, you are going to pick up that pen, and you are going to do exactly what is best for this family. You owe us this, Clara. The tension in the room instantly skyrocketed. It was no longer just a weird, uncomfortable family ambush. It had officially crossed the line into unlawful detention. The audio recorder in my pocket was capturing every single second of it. I glanced over at Thomas Keller. He huffed loudly and took a step toward the table. He was clearly starting to lose his patience with my defiance. He was a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted the second he asked for it, and having a 30-year-old woman stand up to him in front of other people was clearly bruising his massive ego. "We don't have all night, Patricia!" Thomas snapped at my mother. "Get her in the chair. I have places to be." Meanwhile, the notary public, who had been completely silent up until this point, started to realize that something was terribly wrong. He nervously shifted his weight from foot to foot, clutching his briefcase even tighter against his chest. He looked at my dad blocking the locked door, then at Thomas Keller barking orders, and then at me standing defiantly by the table. He was suddenly looking very nervous, his eyes darting around the room as the reality dawned on him that he was essentially being asked to notarize a hostage situation. "Look, folks," the notary stammered, his voice shaking slightly. "If the bride isn't a willing participant, I really can't put my stamp on this. My license." "Shut up and wait," my dad snapped at the notary, not moving an inch from the front door. I stood exactly where I was, feeling the reassuring weight of the legal documents in my purse. They thought locking the door had trapped me in. They had no idea that they had just locked themselves in with me. The living room was so quiet you could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My father stood planted in front of the locked front door, his arms crossed, trying to look physically intimidating. My mother was frozen near the table, her fake, welcoming smile completely wiped from her face. Thomas Keller was glaring at me, clearly furious that I wasn't just sitting down and blindly signing my life away to him. And the notary public looked like he was about to pass out from the stress of being trapped in a room where the bride was actively refusing to participate. They were all waiting for me to break. For 30 years, that had been my role in this family. I was supposed to be the obedient, quiet daughter who eventually gave in to my parents' demands because it was easier than fighting their endless psychological warfare. They fully expected me to look at my towering, angry father blocking the exit, look at the wealthy, powerful Thomas Keller, and just surrender. But I didn't break. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I looked directly past my mother and locked eyes with my father. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream or cry. I just asked him one simple, direct question. "How much do you owe him, Dad?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. My father's face went completely pale. His arms, which had been crossed so confidently across his chest just a second ago, slowly dropped to his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. My mother gasped, taking a sudden step back as if I had physically struck her. "Clara, what are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice high-pitched and trembling. "Oh, who? We don't owe anyone anything. This is about your future." "Stop lying, Mom." I cut her off sharply. I turned my attention back to my father, who was still standing by the door looking like a deer caught in headlights. I didn't let him off the hook. I wanted him to hear the exact number out loud. $175,000. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "That is the exact amount you owe the Keller family, isn't it? And since you don't have the cash to pay off your massive financial failure, I am the payment." The entire room went completely dead silent. It was the kind of silence where you could feel the oxygen being sucked out of the space. My parents were completely paralyzed. They had spent weeks carefully crafting the secret, twisted arrangement, convinced that I was totally clueless. The realization that I knew every single disgusting detail of their transaction completely short-circuited their brains. Thomas Keller, however, didn't look paralyzed. He looked exposed. The arrogant, entitled smirk he had been wearing all evening vanished entirely. He shifted his weight nervously, suddenly looking very uncomfortable standing in a room where his dirty, illegal backroom deals were being dragged out into the light. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Now listen here, Clara," Thomas started, taking a step toward me with his hands raised defensively. "This is just a mutually beneficial arrangement between families. You are overreacting. I'm not overreacting, Thomas, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on him. I'm just reading the fine print, and I suggest you do the same. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out 2 thick, manila envelopes. I walked over to the small table with the white tablecloth, right where they had placed their ridiculous, abusive marriage contract, and I dropped the 2 envelopes right on top of it. Let's play open cards, I said, tapping the first envelope. This is an emergency protection order. It was signed by a district judge this morning at exactly 10:12 a.m. It explicitly lists you, Dad, you, Mom, and you, Thomas. It states that none of you are legally allowed to come within 150 meters of me. My dad finally found his voice, though it was weak and shaking. You're bluffing. You wouldn't do that to your own family. That piece of paper doesn't mean anything. It means everything. I shot back, because it went into effect the second the judge signed it this morning, which means that by locking that door and holding me in this room against my will, you are currently violating a federal court order. I turned to the second envelope and tapped it. And this, I continued, making sure the audio recorder in my pocket was catching every single word, is a copy of the formal investigation file I submitted to Adult Protective Services. It details a multi-year pattern of coercive control, emotional abuse, and this exact attempt at forced marriage and human trafficking. Everything is documented. Every text message, every threat, every lie you spread about my mental health. It's all in there. The notary public let out a panicked squeak. He didn't say a single word. He just lunged for the table, grabbed his official stamp, shoved it into his briefcase, and practically sprinted toward the corner of the room to distance himself from the rest of us. He realized instantly that he was standing in the middle of a massive criminal trap, and he wanted absolutely no part of it. Thomas Keller's face turned a deep, angry shade of red. He realized his money couldn't buy his way out of a state-level Adult Protective Services investigation. You are completely insane, Thomas spat at me, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant punch. He turned to my parents. I am done with this. You deal with your crazy daughter. The deal is off, and I want my money by Monday. Thomas took 3 long strides toward the front door, fully intending to walk out and leave my parents to deal with the fallout. My dad, still operating in a state of sheer panic, fumbled with the deadbolt to let him out. But just as my dad's hand touched the metal lock, the living room suddenly lit up. Bright, flashing red and blue lights pierced through the front window curtains, painting the walls of the room in aggressive, undeniable colors. Someone pounded heavily on the heavy wooden front door. Blackridge Police. Open the door. My mother let out a loud, hysterical sob and collapsed into a chair. My dad froze, his hand still resting on the lock, staring at the flashing lights outside as if he were watching his entire life crumble into dust. Thomas Keller took a massive step backward, cursing under his breath, looking frantically around the room as if trying to find a back exit. Open it, Dad, I said calmly. They already know I'm in here. With trembling hands, my father unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. Standing on the front porch was Officer Daniel Reyes, a tall, no-nonsense cop who immediately stepped inside the house, pushing past my father. Another officer stood right behind him, keeping a close eye on the room. Officer Reyes swept his gaze across the ridiculous wedding setup, the crying mother, the furious rancher, and the terrified notary. Finally, his eyes landed on me. Clara Whitmore, Officer Reyes asked, his tone strictly professional. Yes, officer, I replied, standing tall. I pointed directly at my father, who was now trembling visibly by the door. I am being held here illegally. He locked the door and refused to let me leave until I signed a contract. The notary didn't even wait to be questioned. I didn't know, the notary yelled out, holding his briefcase up like a shield. I was just hired to stamp a document. I'm leaving right now. And with that, he squeezed past the officers and bolted out the front door into the freezing night. Officer Reyes turned his attention to my father. Sir, step away from the door and keep your hands where I can see them. Thomas Keller tried his absolute best to use his town influence to smooth things over. Officer Reyes, right? Listen, this is just a family misunderstanding. I was just leaving. There's no need for... You stay right there, Mr. Keller, Officer Reyes interrupted, his voice leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. Nobody is leaving until I figure out exactly what is going on here. But I already knew exactly what was going on. My plan had worked perfectly. I watched as Officer Reyes pulled out his notepad and began to officially write my father up for unlawful detention. The big, terrifying men who had tried to sell me off to settle a debt were now shrinking under the harsh reality of the law. I reached down, picked up my purse, and walked right past the white table. I didn't look back at my mother. I didn't look at Thomas Keller. And as I walked out the front door, stepping into the crisp, freezing Montana air, I had never felt more free in my entire life. Walking out of my parents' front door that night, leaving the flashing red and blue police lights behind me, was the most surreal experience of my entire life. Inside that living room, my father was actively being written up and cited by Officer Reyes for unlawful detention. My mother was still sobbing in the corner, completely shattered because her picture-perfect illusion of control had just been blown to pieces by the local police. The notary public had already run off into the freezing night, and Thomas Keller was trapped inside, desperately trying to explain to the cops why a 47-year-old millionaire was involved in locking a 30-year-old woman in a house against her will. I didn't stick around to watch them squirm. I got into my car, blasted the heater, and drove away from Blackridge. For the first time in years, the hour-long drive back to Helena didn't fill me with dread or anxiety. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity and absolute relief. The emergency protection order was officially in place, meaning my parents and Thomas Keller were legally barred from coming within 150 meters of me. If they even tried to pull into my apartment complex or show up at my office, they would be arrested on the spot. I was finally, truly untouchable. But while I was sleeping peacefully in my quiet apartment that night, the absolute chaos I left behind in Blackridge was just getting started. If you have never lived in a tiny, isolated mountain town, you need to understand one basic rule. There are absolutely no secrets. Word spreads faster than a wildfire. When a police cruiser parks on the front lawn of one of the town's established families with its lights flashing for over an hour, people notice. Neighbors look out their windows. Phone calls are made. Text messages are sent. By Sunday morning, less than 12 hours after I walked out of that living room, the news had spread incredibly fast in Blackridge. By the time the local diners opened for Sunday breakfast, everyone in town already knew. The rumors were flying, and because my parents had spent the last 2 years loudly complaining to anyone who would listen about my mental instability and my ungrateful behavior, the sudden police intervention painted a very different picture. The Whitmore family instantly became the absolute main topic of gossip. But this time, I wasn't the punchline. My parents were. People were whispering about how Patricia and Robert Whitmore had tried to hold their own daughter hostage. The details of the bizarre, fake wedding setup in the living room leaked out, probably from the terrified notary public who wanted to clear his own name before the rumors dragged him down. The town quickly put the pieces together. They knew my father's business had been struggling. They knew Thomas Keller was a ruthless businessman. It didn't take a genius to figure out that a financial transaction had been disguised as a forced marriage. Thomas Keller's reaction to the fallout was exactly what you would expect from a cowardly, entitled billionaire. The second he realized the town was gossiping and a formal police report had been filed, he immediately went into aggressive damage control. Keller completely denied any involvement in the forced marriage plot. He hired a massive PR team and a group of expensive lawyers to spin the narrative. His official story was that he was simply invited over for a standard family dinner to discuss a business loan with my father. He publicly claimed that he had absolutely no idea my parents were planning to force me into signing a marriage contract. He threw my mother and father completely under the bus, telling the local authorities that my dad was acting erratic and that he, Thomas, was just an innocent bystander when the police showed up. Of course, the emergency protection order with his name on it proved otherwise, but his primary goal was to protect his reputation among the other wealthy elite in Blackridge. He essentially cut all ties with my parents overnight, leaving them to drown in the mess they created. Meanwhile, the legal consequences for my family were escalating rapidly. The formal investigation officially began on Monday morning. Because I had already filed the coercive control report with Adult Protective Services and secured the protection order, the police had to take the situation incredibly seriously. They assigned a lead detective to the case, and Ethan Brooks, my fiercely protective lawyer in Missoula, made sure the police had everything they needed to completely bury my parents. Ethan and I didn't just give the police a verbal statement. We handed over a mountain of undeniable, hard evidence. We gave the detective the 300-page diary I had been meticulously keeping for 2 years, which documented every single threat, lie, and attempt at manipulation. We handed over the crystal-clear audio recording from Saturday night, which explicitly captured my father locking the door, refusing to let me leave, and Thomas Keller barking orders. And perhaps the most damning piece of paper trails, Ethan subpoenaed the emails my mother had sent to the notary public, explicitly inviting him to officiate a legally binding contract at a private residence with no guests. Faced with the audio recording and the digital paper trail, my father's defense completely crumbled. He couldn't claim it was just a misunderstanding when his own voice was caught on tape telling me I wasn't allowed to leave the house until I signed myself over to a 47-year-old man. As a result of the overwhelming evidence, my father faced severe legal charges. He was formally charged with unlawful detention and coercion. But the legal trouble wasn't even the worst part of their punishment. The absolute biggest consequence of their failed trap was financial ruin. Because the marriage contract was never signed, and because Thomas Keller had publicly distanced himself from the entire situation to save his own skin, the twisted backroom deal they made was completely null and void. The massive $175,000 debt my father owed to the Keller family remained exactly as it was. In fact, it got worse. Furious that his name had been dragged into a police investigation, and embarrassed that he had been outsmarted by a records manager, Thomas Keller retaliated the only way he knew how, with his wallet. Keller didn't just leave the debt alone, he called it in. He instructed his lawyers to aggressively pursue my father for the immediate repayment of the $175,000. My parents had banked their entire financial survival on selling me off. Without me as the collateral, they had absolutely nothing left to offer. In the span of a single weekend, my parents lost everything they valued. They lost their pristine reputation in the town of Blackridge, becoming social pariahs and the subject of endless, humiliating gossip. They lost the protection and favor of the wealthy Keller family. They lost their financial stability, facing imminent bankruptcy, and the loss of their home due to the crushing $175,000 debt. And most importantly, they lost their favorite target. They lost the daughter they had spent 30 years trying to control, break, and manipulate. As I sat in Ethan's office a few weeks later, reviewing the legal updates on my father's criminal charges, I felt a deep sense of justice. I didn't feel sorry for them. 4 years, they had tried to convince the world that I was a crazy, unstable failure. Now, the entire town of Blackridge, the local police department, and the state's adult protective services knew exactly who the real monsters were. They had built a perfect trap for me, but they ended up locking themselves inside it. In the weeks following the disastrous ambush in Blackridge, my life in Helena finally returned to its quiet, predictable rhythm. The emergency protection order I had secured acted like an invisible, impenetrable shield around my apartment and my office building. For the first time in my entire adult life, my phone was not ringing at 6 a.m. with my mother demanding to know my exact weekend plans. There were no aggressive, manipulative text messages from my father. The 150-meter legal boundary was completely respected, mostly because my father was absolutely terrified of Officer Reyes, the local police department, and the pending unlawful detention charges hanging over his head. But if you know anything about toxic, controlling families, you know that they never just give up quietly. When they realize they can no longer get to you directly because of a strict legal barrier, they immediately send in the reinforcements. In psychology, these people are often referred to as flying monkeys, friends and extended family members who are deliberately manipulated into doing the abuser's dirty work for them. And let me tell you, my parents deploy their flying monkeys with absolute precision. Since my parents were legally barred from contacting me, they started using my aunts, uncles, and even a few of my old high school neighbors to pass along their desperate messages. My phone started buzzing with texts and voicemails from relatives I hadn't actually spoken to in years. "Clara, your mother is absolutely devastated. She hasn't stopped crying for weeks." One aunt texted me on a Tuesday afternoon. "Your father's blood pressure is through the roof because of his Keller debt, and his business is failing. You need to drop the police charges," an uncle said in a long, guilt-tripping voicemail. They tried their hardest to paint my parents as the tragic victims of a massive misunderstanding. They tried to make me feel horribly guilty for destroying the family over a silly piece of paper. They were desperate because the reality of a $175,000 debt to Thomas Keller was finally crushing them. Thomas was furious that his reputation had been dragged into a police investigation, so he was demanding his money immediately. My parents needed me to drop the protection order and the criminal charges so they could somehow try to renegotiate their standing in the town. But I was not the same broken, isolated girl they used to bully. My professional records manager training kicked into high gear. Whenever a relative called to guilt-trip me, I didn't get emotional and I didn't yell. I simply stated the cold, hard facts. They tried to force me into a marriage with a 47-year-old man to pay off a $175,000 debt. I would say calmly over the phone. They locked me in a room and tried to legally make me sign away my bank accounts, my job, and my freedom to leave the county. If you honestly think that is a silly misunderstanding, please do not contact me again. Most of these relatives didn't know how to respond to cold, undeniable logic, and they quickly stopped calling. However, the indirect harassment was still mentally exhausting. It was a constant, annoying reminder that my parents were still out there, completely refusing to take accountability for their actions and actively spinning a brand new web of lies to save face with our extended family. I realized that simply ignoring the flying monkeys wasn't enough. I needed to establish a permanent, undeniable, written record of exactly where I stood. I didn't want my extended family to think I was just being a stubborn, spiteful daughter holding a grudge. I wanted it documented that the door to reconciliation was strictly locked behind my specific rules. I called Ethan Brooks, my lawyer over in Missoula, and told him exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to send my parents one final, definitive communication. Ethan was very cautious at first. "You have an active protection order, Clara," he warned me over the phone. "You have to be incredibly careful. You don't want to accidentally invite them back into your life or give their defense attorney any reason to argue that you aren't actually afraid of them." "I'm not inviting them back," I told Ethan firmly. "I am giving them an ultimatum, a written record of my absolute terms. If they ever want to have a relationship with me again, they have to play by my rules. And I know for a fact they won't agree to them, which will prove exactly why the protection order needs to stay permanently." Ethan agreed to review the email before I sent it to ensure it wouldn't compromise my legal standing. So, on a quiet Thursday evening, I sat down at my desk in my Helena apartment, opened my laptop, and started typing. I didn't start the email with "Dear Mom and Dad," and I certainly didn't ask how they were doing. I went straight to the absolute point. I laid out 3 very specific, non-negotiable conditions that had to be met before I would ever consider sitting in the same room as them again. The first condition was mandatory family therapy. I explicitly stated in the email that this could not be a casual counseling session with the local pastor in Blackridge who golfed with my dad on the weekends. It had to be with a licensed, out-of-town psychological professional who specialized in narcissistic family dynamics and coercive control. I demanded that they attend at least 6 full months of therapy on their own to address their toxic behavior before I would even consider joining a single session. The second condition was a full, written acknowledgement of exactly what they did to me. I demanded that they immediately stop lying to the extended family and stop playing the victims. I required them to admit, in writing, that they deliberately orchestrated a forced marriage to pay off the $175,000 Keller debt, that my father unlawfully locked me in the living room against my will, and that the vicious rumors they spread about my mental health were complete fabrications designed to isolate me. I made it clear that there would be absolutely no moving forward if they continued to brush their abuse off as a misunderstanding. The third and final condition was absolute respect for my boundaries, moving forward. This meant no unannounced, surprise visits to my home in Helena, no calling my employer to check up on me, no tracking my movements, and no using relatives to pass along guilt trips. They had to accept, unconditionally, that I was a 30-year-old independent woman with my own life, my own money, and my own completely separate choices. I read over the draft of the email 3 times. It was cold, highly professional, and completely devoid of the desperate, people-pleasing tone I used to have when dealing with their endless demands. It read like a strict corporate contract, which felt incredibly fitting given that they had tried to use a fake marriage contract to ruin my life and sell me off. I forwarded the draft to Ethan's office. He replied 15 minutes later with a very short message. It's bulletproof. It protects your boundaries and establishes a clear record. Send it. I took a deep breath, typed in my mother's and father's email addresses, and clicked the send button. Watching that email swoosh away into the digital ether was one of the most surreal, empowering experiences of my life. For 30 years, I had been the one desperately trying to meet their impossible conditions. I was the one constantly twisting myself into knots, trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to manage their explosive tempers, and trying to keep the peace in the family. But with that one single click, the power dynamic was permanently flipped. I was now the one holding the terms. I didn't expect a miracle to happen. Deep down, I knew exactly who my parents were. I knew that their egos and their obsession with their public image were far too massive to ever accept those 3 conditions. Submitting to professional therapy, openly admitting they committed a crime, and actively respecting my independence were concepts completely alien to their entire worldview. But sending that email wasn't really about fixing them or saving our relationship. It was about officially freeing myself from their narrative. I had clearly drawn a massive line in the sand. I had given them a precise, logical roadmap to redemption, knowing full well they would refuse to take it. And when they inevitably failed to meet those conditions, I would never have to feel a single ounce of guilt about walking away from them forever. I closed my laptop, walked into my kitchen, and poured myself a glass of cold water. The apartment was completely silent, and for the first time in a very long time, I realized that the silence wasn't lonely or terrifying. It was deeply peaceful. I was ready for whatever reaction came next. After I sent that email outlining my 3 non-negotiable conditions, I didn't have to wait very long to get my answer. Deep down, I already knew how they were going to react. When you deal with people who have spent their entire lives manipulating others to protect their own image, forcing them to look in the mirror and admit their faults is practically impossible. Exactly 3 days after I sent my terms, an email from my mother, Patricia, popped into my inbox. It was incredibly long, a massive wall of text that perfectly showcased her absolute refusal to live in reality. She didn't agree to a single one of my conditions. She completely ignored the demand for professional family therapy, and she certainly didn't agree to respect my boundaries as an independent adult. Instead, she used the email to frantically point the finger at absolutely everyone else. She blamed Thomas Keller, claiming that he had somehow tricked them into the whole arrangement and that my father was just a victim of Keller's aggressive business tactics. She blamed the notary public for running away and making the situation look suspicious to the police. She even blamed Aunt Marina for being a nosy eavesdropper who ruined a perfectly fine family dinner. And of course, she blamed me. She wrote that if I hadn't overreacted and brought the police into a private family matter, none of this public humiliation would have happened. Reading her email gave me the absolute final piece of closure I needed. It was written proof that she was never going to change, and that walking away was the best decision I had ever made. As for my father, Robert, I never heard a single word from him. He didn't reply to my email, he didn't try to call me from a blocked number, and he didn't send any more flying monkeys my way. His complete silence wasn't a mystery to me. His ego had been completely shattered that night in the living room. Between facing the very real, very serious criminal charges for unlawful detention and dealing with the crushing reality of Thomas Keller aggressively collecting the $175,000 debt, my father was entirely consumed by the mess he had created. He had lost his pristine reputation in Blackridge, he had lost his financial standing, and he had been thoroughly outsmarted by the daughter he thought was weak. His silence was the silence of a defeated man. With the legal boundaries firmly in place and my parents' true colors permanently documented, I realized I didn't want to stay in Helena anymore. Helena was a great city, and it had been a wonderful sanctuary for me, but it still held too much baggage. It was the place where I had received the terrifying midnight phone call from Aunt Marina. It was the place where I had spent 2 years obsessively checking my locks and compiling evidence in my secret notebook just to prove I wasn't going crazy. I wanted a totally clean slate, completely detached from the geographic radius of my family's drama. So, a few months later, I put in my notice at the insurance company, packed up my quiet little apartment, and moved to Bozeman, Montana. Moving to Bozeman was the breath of fresh air I desperately needed. It is a vibrant, beautiful city, completely disconnected from the suffocating, old money politics of Blackridge. I quickly found a new job working as a senior records manager for a much larger firm, a position that paid better and gave me even more independence. I rented a bright, spacious apartment with a view of the mountains. Nobody in Bozeman knew about my family. Nobody knew about the vicious rumors my parents had spread, and nobody knew about the Keller family or the fake wedding setup. I was just Clara, a normal, 30-year-old professional living her life on her own terms. It has been exactly 1 year since that freezing Saturday night in Blackridge. My life today looks absolutely nothing like the nightmare my parents tried to force me into. I don't check my phone in a panic anymore. I don't worry about who is talking about me behind my back. The Adult Protective Services investigation and the court orders did their job, creating a permanent, impenetrable wall between my new life and their toxic reality. From what little I hear through the grapevine, my parents had to downsize their lives significantly to manage the Keller debt, and their social standing in our hometown is practically non-existent. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I sit at my desk in my Bozeman apartment and open the bottom drawer. Sitting right there, resting quietly underneath a few file folders, is my thick 300-page notebook. I still keep it exactly where I can see it. When I first started writing in that notebook, I did it out of sheer desperation. I documented their text messages and recorded their phone calls because I was terrified of losing my grip on reality. I built that archive because I was scared of them, but I don't keep it out of fear anymore. I don't look at it and feel the old, familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. Now, when I pull that notebook out and run my hand over the cover, it means something entirely different. It represents the exact moment I stopped being a victim and started fighting back with cold, hard facts. It is the physical proof that I am smart, capable, and fiercely protective of my own life. I keep the notebook because it serves as a permanent, powerful reminder of the ultimate truth. That night in the living room, I wasn't sold. I saved myself,